Welcome, dudes and dudettes, to Season 4 of Skully Reviews on Sonic Adventure. First Encounter Assault Recon... A bit of backstory.
Let's take a trip back to 2005. I was over at a friend's place for the night, and from what I remember, I had a lot of fun being there. Watching a marathon of action movies like Triple X, The Matrix Reloaded, and The One, as well as playing the newly released at the time Shadow the Hedgehog well into the night.
Suffice it to say, I was having a pretty good time all around. That is, until I decided to get up in the middle of the night.
Now, being the innocent 7-year-old I was, I arrived to see my friend's older brother playing on the PC of what I thought to be a first-person shooter game. I remember him pausing the game and going off to grab a drink or take a piss or whatever the hell he was doing at the time, and then of course me, being the ever-curious little sprout, I decided to go off and see what game he was playing and decided in my infinite wisdom to go off and start playing.
Now, with all that in mind, I'm going to show you the very scene that has haunted my nightmares since 2005.
Needless to say, I did not get any sleep that night, and if you were wondering what my #1 fear of all time is, Alma Wade. Yes, I'm serious. You'd think that as I got older, my fears would shift over to ones of financial troubles, bills, taxes, and crushing existential loneliness, but nope, Alma Wade still has them all beaten.
And how goddamn appropriate is it that the one game that scares me to death happens to be called F.E.A.R?
Well, to be technical, the game's full title is First Encounter Assault Recon. However, the abbreviation itself sounds so cool that I can honestly see why the developers chose the name F.E.A.R. I mentioned during my Demonic Toys review that I wouldn't actually get into the horror genre until around 2009, but I didn't actually play F.E.A.R until shortly after my curiosity for the game was piqued during my Doom 3 commentary around early 2017.
I mean, by this point it was years later, and I'd had plenty of experience in the horror genre thanks to the likes of Silent Hill and Forbidden Siren, so come on, I mean, what's First Encounter Assault Recon? I mean, surely now I'd be able to handle the game that scared me to death as a child. Boy, was I dead fucking wrong, because apparently this game can still scare the shit out of me even at 20 years old.
Playing F.E.A.R all the way through for the first time was an interesting psychological experiment for me. If this was any other horror game out there, I'd be pretty nonplussed about a lot of what's actually in the game and probably find a lot to enjoy about it like I always seem to with these reviews.
But F.E.A.R, however... God, I was a nervous wreck playing this game the first time through.
Don't get it twisted, I wasn't acting like some sort of typical YouTube Let's Player screaming at the sky like I just had my balls cut off with a rusty chainsaw, but I always felt on edge whenever I was playing through this game. I guess paranoia would probably be the best way to describe my state of mind while playing through F.E.A.R for the first time. Every little bit of movement, every little moment, and every single instance of being completely alone in F.E.A.R just left me with a sense of dread that I haven't felt since I first played Silent Hill 1. In fact, given my childhood fear of this game, that fear was doubled tremendously.
Honestly, it still sends a chill down my spine just even talking about this game and the effect that it had on me as a kid, so let's get into the review portion and talk about some development history.
So, F.E.A.R, a game which is basically the result of taking this scene from Doom 3...
Follow me.
and making an entire game out of it. First announced at E3 of 2004, F.E.A.R was brought to life as an action horror game that Monolith Productions wanted to make as more of a cinematic first-person shooter experience. While the tone initially leaned more towards the action side of things, the initial concept of F.E.A.R brought to life series mainstay Paxton Fettel, as well as a cut secondary villain named Conrad Krieg, who was later melded with the original Fettel to become the primary villain for the game. Eventually, however, Monolith decided to shift the focus into a more atmospheric direction, taking inspiration from Japanese psychological horror movies and crafting the game's story out of the subtle storytelling methods employed within the genre. And with this train of thought, this then led to the star of the F.E.A.R series and the queen of my nightmares, Alma Wade. While obvious comparisons might be made to Sadako from the Ring movies, in actuality, Alma's origins actually stem from the novel Ghost Story by Peter Straub, as well as a collective fear from the game's writer Craig Hubbard over his fear of scary little ghost girls that he's had ever since he saw The Shining. Going above and beyond in the technical aspects, Monolith made sure to pay careful attention towards sound design, and ensuring that a large variety of sounds were used to avoid players catching on to repetitive sound effects.
Which is a good bit of attention to detail, don't get me wrong, but it does kind of undercut the horror of your game when I recognise the door opening sound effects from The Simpsons.
One last thing to mention before we get started here is that I won't be covering the expansion packs F.E.A.R Extraction Point and the Perseus Mandate. The big reason why is that with the existence of F.E.A.R 2 Project Origin being released, it essentially knocked these two expansion packs out of canon. And the second reason of which being is that I've been unable to get a hold of these two expansion packs. But of course, on the off chance that Monolith happens to be watching this, or if Warner Bros is watching this more specifically, there is always an opportunity to include these on a F.E.A.R HD collection that bundles all three games, plus the expansion packs in a single collection. You know, just saying, money in the bank right there. But anyway, on October 17th, 2005, the world was soon gripped with F.E.A.R.
So dudes, dudettes, and Armor Camp personnel alike, are you ready to see the game that has made me cower in F.E.A.R ever since I was 7 years old? Well, let's take a look into F.E.A.R's story and find out just what we're getting into.
So the plot kicks off with Paxton Fettel, locked away in a cell and witnessing visions of somebody walking through the flames, influencing him to kill. Suffering a mental breakdown, Fettel awakens an army of soldiers who soon begin to tear out the facility, and our opening prelude concludes with Fettel tucking into tonight's dinner. We then cut over to a control center where members of a specialist military division known as First Encounter Assault Recon inform the player about the situation. Our commanding officer, Rowdy Betters, informs us that Paxton Fettel was a psychic commander, somebody who possesses psychokinetic abilities, and was the man in charge of commanding cloned telepathic soldiers. The research and creation of all this ties back to the military corporation Armorcam, the company itself developing these prototypes before Fettel decided to go rogue and cause havoc for Armorcam, and potentially the country unless First Encounter Assault Recon put a stop to him. In this event, we play as a recent transfer to F.E.A.R known as the Point Man. No name or other details given, other than the fact that his reflexes are totally off the charts.
If I didn't know any better, I'd say that this Point Man is supposed to represent me. And I love me!
This is of course followed up by visions of Fettel questioning our identity, as well as cross-cutting with dissonant screams, followed up by Commissioner Gordon over here, informing the player that they will be a god among men. Our first mission sees us in the Auburn district, after having tracked Fettel's position to somewhere within the dilapidated armor camp facility that has been long since abandoned. Taking a wander around the facility itself, we begin to see a lot of the mystery surrounding the circumstances of this game begin to unfold, as through Point Man's eyes, we can see the echoes of not only Fettel's presence, but also of a little girl heard weeping throughout the building. Rendezvousing with our teammate Spencer Jankowski, we come across a corpse which leads us to call in our autopsy expert Jin Sung Kwong. While she examines the body, Point Man is then sent off to search the area. Initially, I thought that this was an incredibly stupid decision on Jankowski's part, especially considering the fact that Point Man was still relatively new to F.E.A.R at this point, and sending him off to go search for what is ostensibly a psychokinetic man is an absolute disregard for proper military procedure. However, there is a very good reason why Jankowski sent us off, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And of course, like free pizza at an anime convention, Point Man is susceptible to Fettel as he ambushes him and explains that the dead man he found earlier was named Charles Haberger. Fettel briefly talks to Point Man about the memories he has of Mr. Berger, and wonders whether or not the memories are truly his or hers. Before Point Man blanks out, Fettel's last words to him are gonna be what's ostensibly our running theme throughout the game.
He deserved to die. They all deserve to die.
With F.E.A.R having lost Fedor's signal, Pointman returns to Jankowski and Jin, but if you're willing to wait a little bit before you return, you soon get to hear just what Pointman's teammates think of him, and why Jankowski is a little bit put off by having to work with him. From Jankowski's perspective, he feels a little bit disturbed by Pointman's presence, by the way in which he looks at people as if he's staring right through them. Although his fears are then quickly dismissed by Jin, who deems him a poor judge of character.
But this scene does make for a nice little bit of character development in a game which, you know, for all intents and purposes, you might as well be Doom Guy. And it's a point of criticism that I'm probably going to bring up at the end of the story segment.
With F.E.A.R having located the telepathic soldiers to a warehouse, Pointman and Jankowski are sent off with Delta Team to have a look. But not before more visions of what appear to be somebody's birth, and Fedor's voice saying that he tried so hard to forget what happened. Arriving at the warehouse, Pointman is sent off to open the gate, before the Delta Force personnel are all massacred by the same little girl that we saw haunting Fedor in the intro sequence, basically leaving it up to Pointman to investigate further.
So naturally, being one lone soldier, being sent in to fight off a bunch of telepathic soldiers that infest the warehouse is obviously going to go off without a hitch. Okay, that didn't happen, but Pointman does manage to survive an explosion to the face. For some reason.
He awakens later to find Jin reprimanding our commander for sending in Pointman deeper into the facility despite the fact that there is pretty much no one else to go with him, but considering that this is a video game and we are the player, we kind of have no choice in the matter, so Pointman is sent off to further investigate in the facility anyway. Later on, Pointman sees a vision of Fedor interrogating another Armor Camp staff member named Bill Moody about the location of somebody named Alma.
And given that we've already seen visions of a little ghost girl running around the place, I think we all know where this is headed.
One last thing that we learn here is that Armor Camp was attempting to cover up some contaminants in the water supply over here at the treatment plant. Upon finding the deceased Armor Camp researcher, he speaks his last about how Fedor must not be allowed to reach Alma, and mutters something about Project Origin. Doing some digging into the files, Pointman learns from his commanding officer Rowdy that the contaminated water was being distributed all throughout the Auburn district, and that it was the reason why it's been deserted for some time. With the knowledge that Fedor is after key members of Armor Camp's staff, the F.E.A.R team heads off towards their offices within the city, only to find that Fedor and the telepathic soldiers were waiting for them. Pointman's chopper is taken down, with him being the only survivor, so once again, it's up to him to not only deal with Fedor's armada, but also the member of Armor Camp's security force, who for obvious reasons don't want F.E.A.R poking around in their shady dealings.
One other plot point in the game that's never resolved is that Jankowski apparently disappeared.
What actually happened to Jankowski isn't exactly made clear, as it's only really implied in one non-canon timeline thanks to the F.E.A.R expansion pack Extraction Point, where it basically implies that Fedor was the one who killed him. But since F.E.A.R 2 essentially knocked that out of canon, Jankowski's disappearance is just kind of abandoned and left for speculation. The big theory here is that Alma was the one who killed him, as she did with his unit back at the water treatment plant, although it's still pretty up in the air since Jankowski's spirit still haunts the Pointman all throughout the game as a dead echo.
There is more to speculate about Jankowski's disappearance, and considering the way in which his brother was handled in F.E.A.R 2, I think I might save a lot of my thoughts for then, but honestly, it is still something interesting to think about.
Getting back to the main plot, however, Pointman traverses through the offices to find documents and phone calls from Armor Camp staff members that bring mentions to projects like Perseus and Icarus. These projects in question relating to both Fedor and the telepathic soldiers about how they didn't want another screw-up like the failed one with Project Origin. Suddenly, however, a flying fat man falls from the ceiling, introducing himself as Norton Mapes. Mapes is going to be our nerdy guy whose sole purpose in life is to be a complete jerk-ass, eat chips, and basically make us do all the hard work, but goddammit, he's got a goofy theme song, so he's memorable, goddammit. Mapes offers Pointman and F.E.A.R an ultimatum. We shut down the security systems, meanwhile Mapes gives us access to the network to find out just what Armor Camp is doing. Upon disabling the security systems, to the shock of absolutely nobody, Mapes decides to slap his ass at us and runs away, leaving it up to Pointman to gain access to the network manually. While traversing through the facility, we hear Fedor speak about how he knows that Pointman has seen Alma and that she's a prisoner here within Armor Camp's possession. Bettis informs us that Jin has arrived on the site and will convene with Pointman nearby the elevators, where he finds the corpses of two F.E.A.R soldiers whose short-lived careers only spanned one measly supposedly bonus mission, where they were quickly killed by Alma in the PS3 version of the game. While Jin examines the liquefied bodies, Point Man is then sent off to explore further into the offices, where he soon finds the Armacam board member named Aldous Bishop, who has been taken hostage by the telepathic soldiers. After rescuing Bishop and bringing in explosives expert Douglas Holliday, the fire alarm is then tripped, which is basically there to contrive a situation to get Point Man on his own again, and basically things sort themselves out with frightening results. Before we get to said frightening results, we then learn that F.E.A.R was looking for a major scientist working for Armacam named Harlan Wade, as well as his daughter Alice Wade, whose location is up within the executive offices. Anyway, back to the scary parts of the story.
Believe me when I say pants to be darkened, because whether you like it or not, she's getting closer.
Speaking of getting closer, we then learn from Rowdy that the Perseus project was intended to train the telepathic soldiers, with F.E.A.R being the only test subject to be involved in the project. Interestingly enough, however, F.E.A.R is reported to be the second prototype, despite being the only reported success in the field test of Psychic Commanders. Point Man catches up with Mapes, telling him that the telepathic soldiers are out to kill him, ordering Point Man to disable the lockdown, promising that this time he'll stay put.
And so, dudes and dudettes, let me ask you a little question. Does Norton Mapes decide to stay still?
Sayonara, sucker!
Digging up more information on Project Origin, we soon come to learn that Armacam CEO Genevieve Aristide has been up to some sneaky dealings. Such shady dealings include reopening the Project Origin facility and burning all the evidence about what was going on there, much to the chagrin of Harlan Wade, who is a little bit more pissed off about what she's trying to do. The main reason of which for Harlan's outrage being that in reopening Project Origin, Aristide will unleash something that is far more dangerous than she could ever comprehend. As if that wasn't enough, F.E.A.R makes another appearance to the Point Man as a phantom, speaking about how he saw a vision of the future where the world will be engulfed in flames, bodies would litter the streets, and generally the apocalypse would be upon us. Arriving at Harlan Wade's office, Point Man finds Alice, who asks about the location of her father, telling her that Harlan had only ever given her UTM coordinates towards an unmapped location. With a chopper en route, Point Man escorts Alice to the roof. However, that's not before F.E.A.R's telepathic soldiers try to make things a little bit harder for the Point Man.
You don't have to kill everybody!
Jeez, what are you, his aunt? He's trying to protect you from all those mean soldiers who are trying to blow your brains out, you silly sausage.
Unfortunately for Point Man, however, the power cuts out and he and Alice are separated by...
Ugh, God, that never fails at unsettling me.
Alice and Point Man reconvene on the roof, where her evac chopper is blown sky high by the telepathic soldiers. And instead of doing the reasonable thing, like sticking with the trained Matrix-like soldier Point Man, Alice foolishly decides to make a run for it down to the parking lot to her car, so she can run off and find her dad on her own.
Clearly she wasn't the sharpest member of the Wade family, which probably explains why she never appears for the rest of the series.
While chasing Alice, phone calls between Genevieve Aristide and Harlan Wade give us some more insight into what happened with Project Origin, and why things are so tense between the two, as well as the Armacam staff. It's revealed that Genevieve had sent a team down to destroy the Origin facility, as a means of cleaning up a mess that would land Aristide in a lot of trouble. Meanwhile, Harlan Wade argues that she should probably leave well enough alone. Adding a little bit more context to the situation is that we learn from Rowdy that Harlan was the head scientist of the Project Origin research facility, and that the prototype came from a genetic reference. This meaning that F.E.A.R and the first prototype had some DNA that tied them towards another psychokinetic being. With Alice Wade driving off into the night, Point Man meets up with Jin and Holliday, before heading off towards the desolate Orban facility where Harlan's UTM coordinates have specified. This, of course, leading to Interval 8 having a, explosive introduction.
We're hit! Dust 2 going down! Repeat, Dust 2 going down! Hold on to something!
Okay, that didn't happen. However, with Jin and Holliday too roughed up to go up against the telepathic soldiers, this pretty much leaves it up to Point Man to go in and do all the hard work. As Point Man makes it to an abandoned factory, the visions of F.E.A.R and Alma begin to grow stronger, as a phantom of Jankowski informs the Point Man that she's close to him. Descending into the lower levels, Point Man soon makes his way into the Project Origin facility. While we're down there, we catch up with Norton Mapes, who's arguing with Harlan Wade over the fact that Mapes is working in the interest of Genevieve Aristide, as he sets out to burn all remaining information on Project Origin. I'd question why somebody as slimy as Norton Mapes would even bother with this, especially considering the fact that he's going up against the telepathic soldiers, but even now, I have to wonder what sort of power Aristide really had over him when at least Mapes of all people would probably want to get the hell out of Dodge while he still could. The next time we see Mapes, however, let's just say that Harlan decided that Norton could use a little bit more lead in his diet. With Harlan heading into the vault, Point Man finds Mapes bleeding to death, and he tells him that he has to stop Harlan before he releases Alma from the vault, by destroying the reactor core and blowing the facility to smithereens.
And now that we're at to the chapter titled Revelations, I think it's about time we got into a little bit of backstory regarding the lady who's haunted my nightmares since 2005.
Meeting Fettel inside the facility, we see him feasting upon Alice Wade's corpse, before a vision reveals to us that Alma was Fettel's mother, and on top of that, both he and Point Man are in fact brothers.
You and I were born from the same mother. I will set her free.
Finding a laptop with a video file attached, Harlan Wade reveals exactly who Alma is and gives context to her character. He tells us that from a young age she suffered from crippling nightmares and hallucinations that drove her to the point of hysteria. However, it was during all this that Armacam staff member Marshall Disler revealed that Alma was in fact telepathic. And of course, instead of doing the humane thing by putting his oldest daughter out of her misery, Harlan, alongside all the other Armacam staff members that we met throughout the game, decided to experiment on her and use her to give birth to Point Man and Fettel. And when Fettel was 10 years old, he and Alma had psychokinetically synchronized together, causing an incident that killed several people and resulted in Project Origin being shut down, with Fettel growing resentful of his circumstances. And of course, cut to several years later to the beginning of the game, where Fettel synchronized with Alma again, right at the beginning of the game where he tore up the Perseus complex with the telepathic soldiers, with his one goal being to free Alma from where she was imprisoned in Project Origin.
To put it bluntly here, the main villain of F.E.A.R works on two different levels.
You have Alma as the malevolent force of destruction hell-bent on getting revenge upon the Armacam staff that tortured her, and then you have Fettel, who acts more as Alma's mind and voice, so to speak. Hence his line back in the Auburn district about being confused as to whether or not the memories were truly his or Alma's.
But of course, therein lies the question. I mean, if Fettel could be so easily influenced by Alma, then what exactly was protecting Point Man?
Fettel speculated that Alma simply couldn't read his mind as she could read Fettel's, and before any fans try to answer my question, keep in mind, we're not at that game yet, so it is still something that goes pretty unanswered within the context of the first game. Point Man catches up with Harlan, deciding that now of all times would be a good time to put Alma out of her misery, but his plan backfires when Alma decides to show up and kill her father. And yes, I think I know what we're all thinking right now. Point Man reaches the reactor core, and following Mapes' instructions, he destroys the reactor and makes a mad dash to get out of the Origin facility. Unfortunately for Point Man, however, Alma isn't quite done with him yet.
Oh, Jesus Christ, we're getting closer and closer to my childhood trauma right now, so...
You were born here, in this place. I was there. You will be a god among men. Take her back to the vault.
Well, at the very least I can say that much like Alma and Fettel, I managed to psychokinetically synchronize with my 7-year-old self.
Just to recap what's going on here, we just witnessed the birth of Point Man, and by extension Alma's true motivation throughout the entire game. Namely, to have her lost son Point Man return to her. And in case you hadn't thought she suffered enough, throughout the gameplay of that sequence, Alma wasn't trying to kill Point Man at all. In fact, she was trying to embrace him. But because Alma's mere presence is enough to kill the Point Man by simply being around her, you as the player have no choice but to shoot her.
And while that scene does still scare me to death, but knowing everything that's happened in this game, that is some incredibly bittersweet irony knowing that Alma will never be able to hold her firstborn son in her arms ever again.
As a new day dawns over the Auburn district, Point Man makes his way to the surface, but too late it seems as the Origin facility detonates and destroys the surrounding area. By some strange miracle, Point Man manages to survive the blast, rescued by Jin and Holiday who pick him up in a helicopter, and they are probably just as surprised to see Point Man alive as we are.
What about Alma? What happened to her?
Why did you say that? You of all people should know that only bad things ever happen when you say things like...
What was that sound?
And on that creepy note, my friends, that was the story to First Encounter Assault
After the credits finish rolling, we then cut to a phone call from Revolver Ocelot, who talks with the President of the United States about how he has Metal Gear Rex's test data, alongside the shocking revelation that the President himself was actually the third Big Boss clone.
Holy hell. This game is something else, I'll tell you that much.
While a lot of the foreshadowing might be painfully obvious to some, given that Point Man's abilities, the visions of Alma and F.E.A.R show us throughout the game, teasing us about who Point Man really is, plus it being a little bit heavy-handed in the game itself, that being said, I do think that this game does deliver its story pretty concisely. If you're just going for a general run-through of the game, you know, not really bothering to dive into any of the other info, you should get the main gist of the plot just fine. However, if you want to know what more is going on, then you're gonna have to dig a little bit deeper into the story, much in the same way of Doom 3 really, where there are several phone messages and Armacam files for you to listen to in order to get the details surrounding the Project Origin conspiracy. Character-wise, this game is pretty much the Alma and F.E.A.R show, guest starring Norton Mapes of course, so most of the focus mainly goes towards our two antagonists here. As for our allies, while their dialogue might come off as just flavor text to some people, I can't say that I didn't enjoy sticking around hearing Jin, Holiday, or Jankowski, or hell, even our commanding officer Rowdy Betters just banter among each other. As for everybody else, the Armacam staff mostly works in service to fleshing out Alma and F.E.A.R, while also showing us the internal politics inside of Armacam's head honchos, clashing with Harlan getting better at Genevieve Aristide for her foolishness. F.E.A.R itself is very interesting in that a lot of what it plays with story-wise is very intriguing, however there is one aspect of the plot that I feel F.E.A.R falls flat, namely a complete lack of characterization for Point Man himself. Now, in a first-person shooter, I get it. Point Man is supposed to be us, what we see, he sees, and ostensibly, we are Point Man. And in any other video game, I wouldn't mind this. Like, for example, in Doom 3's story, that story could have happened to any other hapless soldier who happened to be caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time. But in the case of First Encounter Assault Recon, this story would not work without Point Man. He's a key player in these events, and the way in which the story develops around him, I honestly just kinda wanted to know what he specifically thinks and feels about his experiences during the game. Unfortunately though, Point Man never talks nor shows any real reaction to what's going on, and honestly that disappoints me.
And I can understand why Monolith would write Point Man that way, in the sense that, you know, our reactions are supposed to stand in for his own, but here's the thing. I'm not Point Man. I'm Skully the Metalhead. I haven't experienced what he's been through or anything of the sort, and to be perfectly honest, I've never been haunted by a psychokinetic ghost girl before. Actually, hang on a second. Yes, I have. It was back during the Silent Hill review. And I can understand why Monolith would have written Point Man this way, in the sense that our reactions are supposed to stand in for his reactions, but here's the thing. I'm not Skully the Metalhead. I'm Point Man. I can't say that I've ever been through what he's been through, and let's be honest here, how many of us have really been haunted by a psychokinetic ghost girl?
Don't get it twisted, it's not a major problem for me that Point Man has no character of his own, but it is something I would have loved to have seen because the most we really get out of Point Man's characterization from this game is from Jankowski of all people, who describes Point Man as being someone who looks like he's seeing through you. Other than that though, I really don't get anything from him. Anyway, outside of my small gripes with Point Man's lack of characterization, there is one last plot point that does bother me.
We never find out what happened to Jankowski.
I'm serious, man. I want an answer, goddammit. If F.E.A.R is ever made, they better damn well explain what the hell happened to Jankowski, because this is clearly the series' biggest mystery, and it's still yet unanswered, and that makes me very sad. Over to the gameplay side of things, if you've played a first-person shooter before, you should have little trouble adapting to F.E.A.R's controls. Taking inspiration from Doom 3, the game also equips Point Man with a flashlight that, unlike Doom 3, is attached to Point Man's helmet at the cost of using up some rechargeable battery life. However, the one advantage that Point Man has over the average soldier in a first-person shooter is reflexes. It acts similar to how focus works in the Matrix Path of Neo, where the world is slowed down, and it allows Point Man to quickly dispose of his enemies as he moves swiftly. Guns range from pistols to machine guns to shotguns, as well as a few juicy sci-fi weapons such as the particle beam. However, heavier weapons such as the repeating cannons and automatic shotgun also make an appearance. Grenades range from regular frags to sticky bombs, as well as a mine that is of great use when you're playing the game with tactics. Speaking of which, now that that's out of the way, there is one fantastic gameplay element that I would like to bring up, as well as a bit of a warning. If you're going to dive into this game guns blazing like you just stepped out of a classic Doom game, you're pretty much destined to die. The enemy AI in this game will not only react to your sound and presence being in sight, but in addition you also need to watch out for your flashlight shining a light which, if spotted, will have the telepathic soldiers making a beeline towards you like free pizza at an anime convention. While you don't need to be a strategic genius in order to outfox the telepathic soldiers, I do advise caution on your first playthrough because, honestly, sometimes the telepathic soldiers scare me about as much as Alma did. The enemy variation in this game, though being somewhat limited in terms of general troops, there are a few special telepathic soldiers such as the heavies, the assassins, and the ones that ride in mechs to give some variety in their approaches. The heavies and mech shooters being the ones that are bullet sponges, and the assassins being nimble and able to vanish via optic camouflage. However, one enemy you will encounter at certain points, and most especially at the end of the game, are the nightmares. Spirits that are summoned by Alma and F.E.A.R, which, though they are weak to a single bullet, they will easily overwhelm you if you play carelessly, so watch your back. In terms of mission structure, the game is based upon the events in the story. However, you are given a mission objective that will give you a clear indicator on what you need to do and where you need to go in order to achieve it. Although, given that the game itself is very linear, I wouldn't worry about getting lost too much in First Encounter Assault Recon. Before we get to final thoughts here, I just want to make a bit of a clarification of those who've never heard of F.E.A.R before or even played the games, but are interested in picking up the series. And the big point I want to highlight here is mostly the game's dichotomy between action and horror. Action-wise here, the game definitely delivers on that front, so you're going to be getting plenty of fast-paced gunplay, and if you're an action junkie, you're definitely getting your money's worth here. Horror-wise, however, the game isn't exactly a jump-scare bonanza, going for more of an atmospheric approach as you see hazy phantoms of F.E.A.R, Alma, and Jankowski, each with vague, audible whispers that relate to the game's story. However, there is a clear divide between an action part of the game and when you can feel Alma's presence looming over you. While both approaches are handled pretty well in their own right, there is a distinct lack of transition, for the lack of a better word, and if you are savvy with either genre, whether it be action or horror, it is something that you will start to notice in a meta sense. Overall, however, the gameplay of First Encounter Assault Recon manages to maintain a decent balance between action and horror, even if the transition between the two elements might not be the smoothest ever handled. However, they are decently well handled when it comes to placing focus on both and when they need to be injected into the game, whether it be action to keep you on your toes or horror to make you scared to even press forward. Over to the technical aspects, graphically, F.E.A.R has aged quite a bit, but I'd say it's honestly no worse for wear than say like Doom 3 or any other 7th generation console game in this style. However, one factor that F.E.A.R does have in its favour is the lighting in this game, which is absolutely fantastic. The game absolutely nailed the lighting in this game, giving the perfect amount of ambience whenever Alma decides to come out and psychologically play with you. In terms of voice acting, the cast manages to hold up a pretty decent performance, but special mention has to go to Peter Lorre as Paxton F.E.A.R. I'm serious, man, his performance is utterly fucking creepy, striking a nice balance between chilling to downright cool to listen to.
Some secrets get buried deeper than others, but I know where to dig. Hush now, Mr. Moody. The time for talk is done.
I mean, seriously, could you just imagine Paxton F.E.A.R reading a bedtime story?
Little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. Then came a spider who sat down beside her, scaring poor Miss Muffet away. The soundtrack composed by Nathan Griggs perfectly suits the atmosphere this game is trying to go for. Militaristic when it needs to be, cold, dark and ambient when you're wandering through lonesome hallways, and even managing to bring in some Middle Eastern influences every now and again. My favourite track in the game, outside of maybe some of the ambient pieces that play here and there, is the intro music to the game. One last thing to talk about will be the approach to psychological horror that the game takes here, which reviewers of 2005 did criticize about the game, in the sense that Alma never really felt antagonizing enough to them, save for the very end of the game, where she isn't even trying to kill you. But to be perfectly honest, I kinda like that about the game. Childhood nightmares notwithstanding, I love the fact that Alma isn't written as the generic scary ghost girl of the week, because despite being hellbent on getting revenge on Armacam, she's given a definitive motive to be reunited with her children, Pointman and F.E.A.R. Her presence constantly looms over the Pointman, and up until right at the end of the game where F.E.A.R outright explains Alma's shadowy presence, we're never truly given a notice of what her motives actually are, which in essence is the foundation in which psychological horror feeds on. Fear of the unknown. It's not about what jumps out at you wanting to rip your face off, but instead a morbidly fascinating mystery that manages to both repulse you, but at the same time drive you to dig in deeper, to the point where you couldn't even turn back even if you wanted to. And F.E.A.R manages to deliver such an experience with great confidence, and to its credit, I think the game does manage to hold on to quite a bit of the fear factor that it once had in 2005.
And with all that out of the way, what are my final thoughts on First Encounter Assault Recon?
Like I said at the beginning of the review, playing F.E.A.R again was an interesting psychological experiment for me. If I was to name the scariest game I've ever played, it's this one. Now, while I'm sure people familiar with my channel are probably bewildered by that, yes, I do admit my lifelong nightmarish fear of Alma Wade might play some heavy influence into that. However, F.E.A.R as a video game strikes a nice balance between horror and action, and handles both elements stupendously. The story presents a corporate conspiracy, but mixed in with some elements of a psychological ghost story, with our two villains in the game not only being downright creepy, but in turn quite tragic given their origins. Throw some solid technical aspects into the mix, and right here, I think we've got a horror game that's going to satisfy fans of both first-person shooters and horror fans alike. In terms of recommendations, if you're a horror fan or love your first-person shooters and are looking for something with a little bit more of an edge to it, then I definitely recommend you give First Encounter Assault Recon a shot. However, the biggest audience I can recommend this game to is for those of you who are fans of Doom 3. If the term spiritual successor was worth anything, then all that you enjoyed about Doom 3 is on display here, and in addition, unlike most spiritual successors seen today, it actually manages to forge its own identity while doing so.
Okay, let me be perfectly honest with everybody here, like, even after playing this game... Okay, I'm gonna be blunt, it put me on edge, and I'm thinking about taking a bit of a break from reviewing horror games, so to give Season 4 of Skully Reviews a bit of a change of pace, next time we're gonna be joining a little club. Catch you later.